cameras off, that is okay, but just keep in mind that the session will be recorded. Now, please begin.
Okay, good morning. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the introduction and thank you especially for the invitation. My name is Fred Tyson, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today about what is been an emerging and continues to emerge as major global public health concerns and issues. And that's the oceans and what's in the ocean environment and how that can affect human health. As well, I want to talk to you someday about climate change too, and how that can potentially have adverse effects on human health and increase public health risk. And ultimately, then how is that related to our oceans and human health concept? So I'm going to start out by giving you an overview of the agency that I work for, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, or NIEHS, as I'll call it from here on out, because that's a little bit easier for me to say. I'm going to give you some background on our institute's mission and how we strive to achieve that mission. And I'm also going to provide some context for why my agency supports this type of research. I want to follow that up with a discussion of climate change, as well as potential health effects that we might anticipate seeing in coming years, and how climate change can affect public health risks that are associated with the oceans and other bodies of water. I'll close up talking about the partnership formed between my agency, NIEHS, and the National Science Foundation here in the US, particularly giving you some specifics about the collaboration, how this partnership supports research on oceans and human health, as well as some of the ongoing projects if time permits, and as well as give you some of the impacts of this research that's been supported over the last couple of decades. So NIEHS is one of 27 institutes and centers that make up the National Institutes of Health here in the United States. All of the other institutes or centers are located in Maryland, either in Bethesda, Rockville, or Frederick, Maryland, but we have the distinction of being located in North Carolina. So we're in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Our mission really is to mitigate the impact that the environment places on human health. And we do that by focusing on the three goals of our strategic plan. And those would be to, I keep losing my cursor. Hopefully I'll find it. There it is. That'll be environmental health sciences is the first goal. Promoting translation of data to knowledge to action is the second goal. And then the third one is enhancing scientific stewardship and support. So I want to talk a little bit about goal one first. To advance environmental health sciences, we support basic biomedical research that asks questions about how environmental exposures are associated with adverse health outcomes. And by exposures, we mean things like air pollution that can either be a combination of different things in the air or single entities like particulate matter or diesel exhaust that comes from vehicles. But air pollution is one of the things. The other things include metals. There are metals that we get exposed to in the environment, like arsenic, cadmium, mercury. There are a number of different metals that have impacts and can have adverse effects on our health if we have chronic exposure to that. There are things like endocrine disrupting chemicals that you find that mimic hormones, and again, cause for aberrant signaling to happen that can also trigger adverse health outcomes. There are things like pesticides, many other types of environmental exposures. So we support research on how these different types of exposures actually at the molecular level may be involved with disrupting biological pathways that again result in altered signaling to cells and tissues and are associated with disease outcomes. Our supported scientists use both in vitro or cell-based models that would include two-dimensional cell cultures, three-dimensional cell cultures, microfluidic systems, as well as using animal models, which can be rodent models like mice or rats. As well, we also support studies that use fish models or worms. The fish that we support, there are studies using zebrafish because they're really cool to use because you can actually see how they develop over a few days period from when the eggs are fertilized. We also support studies that use other fish like Gulf killifish and Medaka. We also can support studies that use non-human primates. These are generally going to be macaques. Not that many studies that we use with primates, but we also then have a large component of our research that actually uses human subjects for studies. Not that we do experiments on humans, but we have populations where we can characterize the types of exposures that they've had and then do really sophisticated types of analytic and that epidemiological analyses on those populations. We also support studies that use machine learning and computational methods. So we have in silico. So I said we do in vitro. I gave you some animal models that we use for, as well as populations that we use for in vivo studies. We also do support in silico studies. So we use those types of things to develop data. Well, what do we do with that data? Well, obviously our scientists publish it because if they don't publish, then there's an old adage, publish or perish. So they have to publish. But what do we really want that data for? We want that data so that it can impact human health. So that brings us to our goal 2, which is promoting translation of that data to knowledge and then to action. What do we mean by that? Well, the molecular studies that we do that our institute supports, they can identify molecular targets that may be, again, good, suitable targets for therapeutic interventions or different types of interventions. All interventions don't require pharmaceuticals, but there are a number of different types of interventions or policy that we can inform with this data. So when we talk about promoting translation, we want the data to go to knowledge to action so that we can do things that enable people, empower people to use some of that knowledge to protect themselves, as well as this can inform public health policy that local, state, federal agencies can use to inform policies that are going to protect health. So we want this data, and it can also, again, help with develop therapeutic interventions. Everybody, I see people wearing masks. I don't have one on because I'm at home, so I don't have to wear it at home. But we also are supporting studies also that have to do with COVID-19, looking again at molecular targets and how we might be able to develop interventions. Right now, people are certainly doing things to do preventive types of studies, but we also are supporting scientists that are looking at novel ways of doing interventions. And hopefully they're using the data that they're getting from goal 1 studies to then go to the goal 2. The third goal that we have is enhancing scientific stewardship and support. And by that, we mean we have an obligation or commitment to training the next generation of environmental health scientists. Some of you all may be that in the next generation. We have a commitment to doing that type of training. We also have a commitment to building capacity, so that there are institutions that may need infrastructure support that we can assist with in terms of how they might conduct their research. So through these 3 goals of advancing environmental health sciences, promoting the translation of that data that we are able to develop and generate into knowledge that then can become action that can actually positively affect public health outcomes is the second goal. And then making sure that we're training and supporting capacity to be able to conduct environmental health research, science research, as we move down the road. So I'm going to shift now over to the topic of the talk today, which is the oceans and human health. I'm also, if you notice, I've thrown Great Lakes in on this too. Great Lakes are not an ocean, but I'll tell you why we consider those as well as part of this program that I've been managing, I guess, since its inception in 2004. Our oceans and coasts affect us. Conversely, we affect them as well. Things that humans do affect what goes on in the coastlines and the oceans as well. And in the US, over 50% of our population lives in coastal shoreline counties, but globally, over 60% of the world's population lives in coastal areas. So it's really important, if we're interested in protecting human health, that we know something about the environment that so many people live in and what we might do to mitigate the environmental health risks that are associated with living in such close proximity to shorelines. You have things like population growth and events that are associated with climate change, as well as increased or changing uses of resources. that are emerging challenges that are being faced by these different coastal populations. I said I would tell you a little bit about why we want to talk about Great Lakes, and so I'm going to do that now. There are 5 Great Lakes: the Lake Superior, Huron, Michigan, Ontario, and Erie. And they make up the largest body of fresh water on the earth, accounting for about 1/5 of the freshwater surface on our planet. And there are approximately 40 million people between the US and Canada who live in the Great Lakes Basin. It's the world's largest supply of drinking water. And then what I would say about the Great Lakes, as well as the oceans, they're extensively used for commercial fishing, being the major source of protein staples for populations in coastal areas, as well as non-coastal areas. You know, we eat fish, we eat shellfish. There's vegetation that comes out of the ocean. It's really a primary protein staple. So it's critically important that we study these oceans and what's in them. People also use them for recreational purposes. We use them for commerce. There's a lot of industry and commercialization of oceans and Great Lake waterways. They're used for transportation and industrial operations like mining and drilling. So people are coming into contact with oceans, shorelines, and the Great Lakes, as well as putting stuff in there that's not really good for the oceans or us. Okay, so public health concerns that arise in the oceans and coastal regions and Great Lakes really come from a combination of a number of activities. They're human activities, biological events, geophysical events, and climate change related events. And so it's consistent with our mission at NIEHS to protect human health from the burden that all of these things, either alone or in combination, really do to contribute to the development of environmental health risks. In 2020, the US coastal population was over 127 million people. That's approximately equivalent to the entire population of Japan. Now, that's a lot of people who are at risk for any type of adverse health outcomes that are due to marine exposure. And within that population, there are subpopulations who reside in coastal areas who are going to be at even greater or risk or more vulnerable to these risks that are due to any of these events alone or in combination. These subpopulations are going to include elderly people, children, tribal populations, low-income populations, populations who live on subsistence diets, and people with physical or mental disabilities. So I want to talk a little bit about the types of pollution that we might find, or not that we might find, but that we do find in the ocean. And the primary sources of pollution in the ocean are anthropogenic or human activities that impact or pollute the oceans. And in turn, the things that we do to the ocean come back to us in terms of impacting human health. Pollution of the oceans is really widespread, it's worsening, and in most countries, it's really poorly controlled. What constitutes this pollution is really a complex mixture of toxic metals, plastics, manufactured chemicals, petroleum, urban and industrial waste, pesticides, fertilizers, pharmaceutical chemicals that people may flush that will end up being part of the runoff that gets into oceans, as well as you have agricultural runoff and human sewage. More than 80% of the pollution that you see in the ocean really comes from land-based sources. It reaches the oceans through rivers, streams, creeks, tributaries that run off and ultimately end up in the ocean. And it can also be there's also a contributor comes from atmospheric deposition. When it rains, you can have condensates of particulate matters or whatever that end up getting into the ocean just from rainfall, or just because they kind of, for lack of a better word, fall out of the sky. We're talking about microscopic things, not things that you're going to see falling out of the sky. But the atmosphere can deposit many types of things into the ocean as well that are part of the pollution complex. You find the pollution is heaviest near coastlines and most highly concentrated along the coastlines of low and middle income countries. I want you to really kind of take note of this thing I have up here called microplastic. Plastic is a rapidly increasing and highly visible component of ocean pollution, with an estimated 10 million metric tons of plastic waste entering into our oceans each year. Now, I mentioned metals before. Mercury is really the most, is the metal of pollutant of greatest concern in our ocean. It's released from two main sources, either coal combustion or small scale gold mining. What happens is it enters into fish, and it bioaccumulates there. People can be exposed to mercury by consuming contaminated fish. Okay, I have something else up here called POPs. That's persistent organic pollutants. That can come again. I mentioned some of the things, pesticides, fertilizer, these types of things. The thing about persistent organic pollutants is they tend to, we call them persistent because they tend to stay. They don't break down. And they also tend to bioaccumulate. So that means they get into the food chain. They will accumulate in shellfish. They'll accumulate in finfish. You'll have apex predators, or big fish eat small fish, bigger fish eat the big fish. Then you have apex predators that will eat, like marine mammals that will eat fish, as well as these also end up in the human food chain as well. So I want to point out to you on this slide, there are really kind of two kinds of pollution that we're going to talk about, and that's point source, which is represented in this upper panel, and then non-point source. Okay, point sources of pollution include effluents that are released from factories, oil refineries, as well as electronic manufacturers or other types of things that deposit waste in chemical pollutants directly into waters like rivers or streams, creeks, whatever, that ultimately drain into the ocean. But we should keep in mind one of the biggest and major causes of pollution in aquatic bodies is really this non-point source of pollution, which again is represented in this lower panel. And the non-point source pollution ends up in the ocean as a function of runoff. When you have, again, streams, things run off of these different areas and they get into waters that then ultimately deposit these pollutants into the ocean. Non-point source pollution has many, many, many origins. Such as septic tanks that are in homes or from homes. Individual cars, trucks, boats, other types of vehicles are sources for non-point pollution. Plus, you have larger sources such as farm operations, ranches, or forest areas. Around the world, you have millions of motor vehicle engines that drop small amounts of oil each and every day onto roads and parking lots. This too gets washed off by rain, ends up in runoff, and makes its way into the ocean. I mentioned atmospheric deposition already. You can also have something called agricultural eutrophication. That's a fancy way of saying fertilizers run off and again end up in the ocean because again rainwater will wash the fertilizer, which is a lot of nitrate, phosphate, which goes into these different types of bodies of running water that ultimately deposit these things into the ocean. You also have to consider that human sewage is yet another contributor to this. So I mentioned these POPs earlier, just to tell you, these are, again, these persistent organic pollutants that they tend to bioaccumulate in microorganisms. They're consumed by finfish, shellfish, and they end up in the food chain. Again, these include pesticides, herbicides, polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs are what they call them. Metals, as I mentioned, which mercury is the primary one we worry about in the ocean, as well as pharmaceutically active compounds. They're characterized, again, by their persistence, their availability to biological entities, as well as the toxicities that they all have. So I'm going to shift the focus now from chemical pollutants to talking about harmful algal blooms and the toxins that are produced by harmful algal blooms. And I'm not going to keep saying harmful algal blooms. There's an acronym for that. In the federal government in the US, we use acronyms for everything. So the acronym that is for harmful algal blooms is HAB, or HABs. So for the rest of my time talking, I will probably say HABs more than harmful algal blooms, or HAB toxins rather than harmful algal bloom toxins, just because it's easier for me to get out of my mouth. So So a recurrent theme that you're going to hear from me today again is that our oceans and coasts affect us and we affect them. And why should we be concerned about halves? We should be concerned about halves because they pose a real major health risk to people. And with over 60% of the global population living in coastal areas, 60% of the world's population face health risks that are associated with halves. Okay, so moving along, let me tell you what harmful algal blooms or HAB events are. A HAB event occurs, a harmful algal bloom event occurs when you have microscopic colonies of algae that will have an explosive and uncontrolled growth spurt that accumulates in huge biomasses. You see these pictured on this particular slide. You see a red tide of blue-green algae. This is also red tide. These biomasses can really stretch for a long way. They can be well over 100 miles or 160 kilometers in length. They occur both in marine waters as well as freshwater habitats. It's the blue-green algae that you see in the freshwater habitats. We'll talk a little bit about that. I was asked to give you all some background material, and one of the links I sent was a TEDx talk that I did about 5 years ago in Durham, North Carolina, where I focused on something called domoic acid, which is a potent HAB toxin with neurotoxic effects. It also can have very potent respiratory effects as well. And domoic acid is really only one example of a toxin from a HAB. An occurrence of a HAB event that you might be more familiar with locally or not, but it occurs in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and we call this the Florida red tide or just red tide. And it's caused by a marine microorganism called Karenia brevis. I should have told you also the domoic acid is caused by something called Pseudomyxin. We're not testing it, so you don't have to worry about that. At least I'm not testing it. But the red tide is caused by something called Karenia brevis, and the toxin that it makes is called brevetoxin. As I said, brevetoxin is a potent neurotoxin, and it can also exacerbate existing chronic respiratory conditions when the aerosolized toxin is inhaled. It can also cause, again, neurological symptoms. In fact, we're supporting a study right now that's being conducted off of the coast of Florida by a particular research institution that's looking at the impact on neurological symptoms in elderly patients that were exposed to a massive red tide outbreak off the coast of Florida a little bit over a year ago. People who are more familiar with New England area may also have familiarity with a brown tide that's produced by something called alexandrium. Alexandrium produces a toxin called saxitoxin, which can cause paralysis. People living in the Caribbean may be familiar with something called a microorganism called Ciguatera, which produces a toxin called ciguateratoxin, and this can cause diuretic shellfish poisoning. So as I mentioned, freshwater harmful algal blooms also exist, and they're mostly called blue-green HABs or cyanobacterial blooms. And they produce a number of toxins that can impact both humans as well as our pets. A lot of times you'll see newspaper clippings, at least locally or different places around the United States, where there are pet kills, where people's pets have wandered into retention ponds or local areas where you can see this green scummy stuff. And it can actually be fatal in some cases. I'll tell you a little bit more about the impacts of the cyanobacterial blooms in a few minutes. So I want to just I don't know if anyone looked at that TED Talk, but I'll just kind of go over some of the things about domoic acid, which I mentioned as an example of a harmful algal bloom toxin. Again, it's a very potent neurotoxin, and it can cause memory decline, cognitive deficits, as well as behavioral problems. This toxin gets into the food chain after being produced by the microscopic algae. It's eaten by small fish. If you follow this little flow diagram on this slide, this is the molecule that is domoic acid. It can then be consumed either by finfish or shellfish. Fish are consumed by small fish or eaten by larger fish that are in turn consumed by marine mammals as well as humans. Because again, it can also go into shellfish, which we also eat. domoic acid in particular in the Pacific Northwest in the US is a real problem because it bioaccumulates in something called razor clams. There are indigenous populations that live around the Puget Sound in Washington State. And they harvest razor clams. You probably can't see this. I'm going to put my hand up. Razor clams generally that are harvested are about the size of my hand. They're fairly good size, and they can provide a very good meal. They're not just, people don't just use those for subsistence diets, but again, the indigenous populations around the Puget Sound, that is their primary staple. But they also have commercial value, that they're served at restaurants, they're shipped around. I've never had one, but I understand they're very tasty. But the problem is that when the Pseudonychia, that's the microorganism that produces domoic acid, when that count is high, then there's potentially a high count of domoic acid in the razor clams. The reason that we see impacts on cognitive memory, cognitive disturbances or function or memory decline or behavioral issues is, again, you have so many people that eat these as a primary protein staple, and they're actually, some of our research or some of the supported research we've done has impacted policy both in the tribal populations in Washington State, as well as the State Department of Washington Health, in terms of not regulating, but encouraging, for instance, limiting the amount of razor clams that pregnant or nursing moms should eat, actually encouraging not to eat if they can avoid it, as well as children. We try to keep them, the limits that they eat down so that they don't have this accumulation of domoic acid in their system that can then be correlated with a lot of the effects that we see, health effects that we see in humans, as well as what we see in the animal and cellular models that we are supporting study for. And again, domoic acid is just one example of a harmful algal bloom toxin. Just in the US alone, there are many different toxins, and they occur globally, not just in the US, but they're all over the world. And in the US alone, there are over 60,000 cases annually reported of poisoning because of exposure to harmful algal bloom toxins. Okay, so this again is a picture of, in a freshwater body, of a cyanobacterial toxin. And these HAB toxins can have a multitude of health impacts. So I've mentioned that it can cause something called amnesic shellfish poisoning, paralytic shellfish poisoning, diuretic shellfish poisoning. They can exacerbate or even be instrumental in causing immune disorders, behavioral and cognitive deficits, as well as memory decline, which I've mentioned a few times. They can cause respiratory issues, liver cancer, and reproductive toxicities. The list goes on. There are more, but that's kind of a pretty exhaustive list of the types of things that can happen. Not saying it always does, but it can happen in response to exposure. We and our pets can be exposed to these in a number of different ways, 3 different ways, really. You can be exposed to these toxins by dermal contact. That's skin. If you get in waters, or your pets get in waters that have these toxins in them, you can get exposed and perhaps have health consequences just because these came in contact with your skin. You can also come in contact with these toxins by inhaling aerosolized toxins. This is a big problem with the red tide or the brevetoxin that I mentioned, that's formed by the red tide or the Corynea brevis microorganism. These toxins, the red tide toxin or brevetoxin, becomes aerosolized, and that can have impacts on both people as well as their pets that live in a region. I think that these sometimes you're finding health effects that sometimes from the red tide that can go as far as 10 miles inland because of the wind blowing the toxins, the aerosolized toxins. And then the third route of exposure that you can get is through the consumption of contaminated food. Again, these toxins get bioaccumulated both in shellfish and finfish, which are part of our regular diets. These harmful algal bloom events can also wreak real havoc on a local ecology by causing massive fish kills, oxygen depletion, which creates dead zones in areas of water that you'll see, which also will kill the coastal wildlife, and it can cause real regional economic impacts due to having to close beaches, having to shut down commercial fishing enterprises, as well as having adverse impacts on fisheries, which will again contribute to a real substantive economic loss. Now, at my agency, we're cognizant of economic impacts, but our real focus is on health. We don't really focus on the economy at NIEHS. Our mission is to really try to protect human health. But that's, again, things that can happen as a result of these bloom events, both in freshwater blooms as well as marine blooms. So what does NIEHS do to support research that's really going to have positive impacts or reduce the negative impacts of ocean pollution, both via chemicals or harmful algal blooms or other types of pathogens that I'll talk about a little bit later on? Well, we put dollars into this in terms of research entities. We support research entities both all across the US, which can be academic enterprises like universities and colleges, as well as just research enterprises that don't confer degrees. And we also do supporting of some programs that are also not domestic. We do have projects that are funded around the world as well, but most of our support is domestic. I can tell you that in fiscal year 2020, our fiscal year 2021 actually will end at the end of this month, so I don't have figures for this. But in fiscal year 2020, the NIEHS invested over $8 million in the support of oceans and human health research. We did this through a number of different activities. We have a collaboration with the National Science Foundation that I mentioned on my first slide, and if time permits, I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the program. What types of areas of science do we support with these research dollars? Well, we're looking at have toxin health effects. We want to look at a molecular level to see what actually is going on, what pathways are disrupted, are epigenomes. And if I say things that you don't know, and I don't know who knows what, so if I talk about an epigenome or genome, put a question in the chat box. We can talk about that later. But do they reprogram epigenomes? Are they causing DNA damage? What types of things do these cause? And if they do that, are we then able to identify potential therapeutic targets down the road? We also want to assess the impact of chemical pollutants on seafood safety. That's a big priority because, again, as I mentioned, oceans as well as Great Lakes and other freshwater bodies are the sources of are tremendous sources for protein that the world's population is going to consume. So we know that some of our food supply is contaminated. So we have to do monitoring of that. We also support training. As I told you, one of the parts of the third goal of our strategic plan is to stewardship and support. And part of that is training. So we have a number of different programs, and most of our grants have some aspect of training components. So graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, undergraduate students get trained in approaches or how they might conduct research, how they might take their own ideas and then turn that into research projects that can be funded. And I just can give you an interesting aside is that we do have a training component. One of our trainees, a postdoctoral fellow, has actually gotten 2 patents on something that actually is it's an edible. It's a kind of clay that can be consumed that will actually remove chemical pollutants from human guts that people may have gotten through either inhaling or primarily through consuming contaminated food. And this is something that's very exciting. I mean, it has not been brought yet into clinical trial or play, but the person has already, the industry sees such potential in it that they've already secured 2 patents. So that's really an exciting thing. The training component is very valuable because folks like yourself come with new ideas. I'm an old guy, I got old ideas. We look for people for new ideas. So it's really important that we train our next generation of scientists. I also have down here a box that says disaster response. I will talk a little bit about climate change in the next few minutes, but disaster response, we're seeing an increase in the number of severe weather events like hurricanes and storm surges and that type of thing. And we have an investment that we make into the disaster response. So when you have a hurricane or severe storm You have infrastructure with your water drainage, your storm drainage things that can be disrupted. In coastal areas, you may have sediment in the coast, in the shore line, or the just, immediately just past the shore in not so deep lying areas of the ocean, that these strong winds and waves and severe weather can actually stir up that sediment and redistribute pollutants that are sitting in that sediment and create new risk for people where they hadn't been a risk before because they were so deeply buried. Now they're up in the surface, and again, they may have the opportunity to become aerosolized, or when you have flooding, these then chemicals can then enter into actual residences. So you have issues with disaster. One of the things that we do in our disaster response is we train workers who are going to be first responders, how they can go in and help mitigate these areas where you have these disasters, how they may help clean up areas, but also be protected so that they are not exposed to increased risk while they're being of service to try to help the residents of the communities that they're working in. I have another box, a green box that here says stakeholder engagement. When we talk about public health risk, we're not just talking about this from an academic pursuit, an intellectual pursuit, a research pursuit. Yes, people are doing studies to learn how these things work and how we might protect people. But there are a number of different stakeholders. That includes the people who actually live in these areas that are at risk. So you have homeowners associations, you have public health advocacy groups that are stakeholders who want to be engaged in setting the research priority. You have groups like they call river watch, that people who live around a river are really concerned with the ecology of the river, and they also are concerned with their own health, their family's health. So you have different types of stakeholders. You have both local, municipal, and state public health agencies that have a stake in how you predict. So we provide resources to allow the engagement of a variety of different types of stakeholders to have an impact and influence on the research agenda that the academics and investigators we're supporting do. We support the stakeholders as well. So they have resources that we provide to engage them so they can help not only just set the priorities for the research that's being done, but also ensure that the data that's being developed is disseminated in a manner that the people who are not scientists can access it and use it to help improve their own public health. So that's a very important piece that we do. I have in here also that we do conference support. What are conferences? Well, they're just like this conferences. They're a place for folks that exchange ideas. Scientists come and they can challenge questions that other folks, they can challenge the data, or they also have opportunities to form new questions after hearing the results or seeing that the research designs that other investigators have. They can contribute to those designs. They may form new collaborations. They may ask new questions. It's very important. It's a very important piece of the research enterprise. So we support conferences. It doesn't cost a lot of money, so we don't put a lot of money into that, given the amount of money that we actually put into research. But conferences are really integral to any research enterprise in terms of this brings together scientists so they can actually talk about the research they're doing. If there are weaknesses in it, they can figure out how to strengthen it, and they can, they can bring the strength that one particular laboratory might have to another laboratory and form these novel collaborations that can ask questions that have not been able to be asked before. So that's an important piece of what we're supporting with our Oceans of Human Health research. And the last little box I'm going to talk about is tech development. If we want to have an impact on public health, the best way to have an impact is if you prevent the exposures altogether. So what does that entail? That entails being able to forecast certain things. So we typically, there's another agency in the US called the National Ocean, I'm just going to say it's NOAA because I get tongue-tied, but it's National Oceanic and Atmospheric something Association. I forget the exact name. But they have satellites that they do all of this satellite imagery. You have another group of folks that access that satellite imagery. They develop all kinds of algorithms, and they're able to integrate the data from the satellite imagery, as well as they have what we call in situ monitoring. So these are basically buoys or robotic devices that are placed in the water that can sample the water. They can actually conduct little experiments in the water, do analyses, and then, send those results back to the laboratory. So we are supporting things. There's something called an environmental sensory processor that we helped support the development of about 10 years ago. And this is something that is critically important in determining or being able to forecast a HAB event before it happens in terms of this, excuse me, environmental sensory processing device. It's a robotic thing that actually can measure various different geophysical, geochemical components in the water that it's immersed in. That can be predictive of the conditions that are favorable to the formation of a harmful algal bloom event or something in the life cycle of a harmful algal bloom microorganism that is going to be favorable to supporting it. So we support technology that is going to help us better protect or better predict events so that we're able to better protect the population. Okay, I'm keeping a check on time here, so I'm I'm running a little longer than I thought I would be, so I'm probably not going to get to everything I wanted to get to. But what I'm going to do now is shift over to what the potential impacts of climate change are, and we're going to focus on this little wheel that's turning around. With climate change, you know, what are the things we're seeing? We're seeing rising temperatures. What do rising temperatures contribute to? Rising temperatures contribute to extreme heat. You know, I don't know what you all are feeling, but where I live, these last few years, it's been hotter than it's ever been. I'm not going to tell you how long I've been alive. I've been alive for a while, and this is the hottest time I've ever lived in. You know, regularly. It seems like we have two seasons: a little brief winter and then summer for the rest of the year. Where I live, where I grew up actually in New Jersey, where we have 4 seasons. In North Carolina, it seems like there's only 2: a short winter and a long, long, long summer. Okay, so when you have this extreme heat, what are the consequences? You see heat-related illnesses and death. A lot of it has to do with cardiovascular or failure, or for lack of a better word, heart attacks. When you have these severe weather things, like again, your hurricanes or big storms, big tropical storms, you can get injuries, fatalities. There are mental health impacts associated with that because people can be without vital resources for a long time. There's trauma associated with seeing your home, your possessions, everything destroyed in a matter of minutes. So there are mental health impacts that are associated with that. With, again, these rising temperatures, another thing that you're going to see are increasing levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. This contributes to air pollution. And what does air pollution contribute to? It contributes to asthma or other respiratory diseases, as well as cardiovascular disease, again, potentially heart attacks. Rising temperatures contribute to something else that's critically important. That's a change in vector ecology. By vectors, I mean things that can actually carry different types of diseases. Let's talk about mosquitoes or ticks. Mosquitoes are certainly carriers or vectors for malaria or dengue or West Nile virus. Then you have things like ticks that are vectors for Lyme disease. The big change that is so critically important that we need to be aware of and cognizant of is we're seeing an expansion in the range of these vectors, these mosquitoes, these ticks, these other things that are carrying disease. So you're seeing incidents of these types of disease like Lyme disease, West Nile virus, malaria. You're seeing them in latitudes that are farther north or farther south than they used to exist because you're having changing temperatures going up and down the different latitudes. And that is expanding the host that these types of vectors can actually survive in. So you're seeing incidences of diseases in places that you had never seen before. And that's one of the really critical public health risks that's associated with climate change. The other things that we see are increasing allergens that are going to, again, impact respiratory things like allergies, as well as asthma. Down at the bottom of this slide, you're going to see a couple of things that talk about water quality impacts. You'll see on here something called cholera, other types of factors. There's something that's not listed on here, which is actually a big thing in the US, which is called Vibrio myrmecophagus. We see big changes in Vibrio population growth as a result of change in temperatures and the water quality. Harmful algal blooms is at the bottom of this panel. We talked a bit about harmful algal blooms. I'll say a little bit more about that in the upcoming slide in terms of what we think climate change impacts are on that. They also are going to compromise food security. Okay, so as you compromise water quality, as well as food supply, you're going to see an increase in different types of contamination in food. Around the world, we have issues of food security, and every country certainly has issues with that in some segments of their population. But we're going to see an increase in that because there's going to be more malnutrition that's associated with that, as well as diarrheal types of disease. I saved this last panel for the last one. It's kind of extreme, but again, if we continue on the path that we're on now, this is something that we're going to see. You're going to see environmental degradation. You're going to see areas that no longer become livable. And when that happens, you're going to see mass forced migrations. Generally, historically, what you see when you have these large forced migrations there are ultimately going to be some type of civil conflicts that result in it. Again, I'm giving you extreme cases. So this is not to say run out from here and say, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. Not coming to an end today. But these are things that we really need to be cognizant of. Climate change is going to impact us in a number of different ways. And again, we talked about forced migration, irrespective of having civil conflict. That again is going to have mental health conflicts if you have to leave your homeland or your home area because it is no longer happening. Okay, I see I'm rapidly running out of time too, I think, right? You're going to keep me posted. So again, as we continue to talk about climate change impacts, I'm not going to go through this slide the way I had intended to, but again, we can see that there are just going to be a number of different health impacts that are going to be associated with either rising heat. In outdoor air quality is going to be impacted. That's going to also we're going to see an increase in wildfires, which in our country we see regularly. This is the season for wildfires, and we are destroying forest land and residential habitats at record rates. It's also going to compromise our atmosphere. So we're going to see increases in ozone as well as particulate matter. And this is going to, again, raise health risk for cardiovascular disease as well as respiratory diseases and death. I talked about the vectors thing. I want to say that I've spent a lot of time talking about mental health and well-being, so I won't talk about that. I will talk about this one. A climate driver is going to be a rising sea surface temperature, which is going to change precipitation and runoff, and it's going to affect coastal salinity. When you have these types of changes, that is going to create environments that are more conducive for growing of certain types of pathogens. I mentioned Vibrio vulnificus earlier. This is something that climate change is really impacting in terms of their growth kinetics, the persistence of the outbreaks of Vibrio when you see them, as well as their distribution. So again, there are a number of different things that I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move past this slide and go on to the next one. A key message here that we have, and I'm sorry that this is just saying about all Americans because this was actually put together for a domestic audience. But again, we talk about all of these different types of climate drivers. I'm going to focus. I'm just using this slide to kind of lead into another one where I want to mention something I haven't talked a lot about, which is sea level rise. We've mentioned certainly increased temperatures, the precipitation exchanges, which are going to go along hand in hand with the extreme weather events. But there's also this extreme, this sea level rise. And I should talk a little bit, actually, I will talk about that just a little bit more because I do have time to dwell on that in subsequent slides. But there's actually this gray box to the right here that I want to focus on, something that I have not really talked about, which is a social and behavioral context we need to think about with regards to climate change. Everybody is not going to be impacted in the same way. There are certainly going to be impacts that are different based on age as well as gender, race and ethnicity that may be associated with different socioeconomic status or poverty, which is a better way, probably a more direct way than saying socioeconomic status, which is a nice, kind way of talking about poverty. But those who are in a low socioeconomic status or who have living in impoverished conditions are going to be at risk for greater impacts as a result of climate change, as well as a number of other social contexts. If we talk about racism, sexism, ageism, a lot of all the different isms, they are going to contribute to different types of health outcomes that are seen amongst different segments of the population. And that kind of leads into this next slide, in that people and communities are going to really be differentially exposed to these hazards, because again, depending on what your socioeconomic status is, that's going to tell a lot about what your resources in your community, what your actual physical infrastructure, your housing, and that type of thing looks like. And folks who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum are going to have a disproportionate impact from climate-related health risks. So again, these populations that are going to have greater health risks include children, older adults, the low-income communities, and some communities of color. And that's really the take-home message from this slide. There are going to be different impacts based on different parameters that we see in society. So I want to also tie in how climate change can impact oceans and human health. There are a number of different ways this can happen. We can see sea level rise. We can see sea surface temperature change that impacts our storms. We can see an expanse in chemical exposures and risk, as well as population whose growth can contribute to how many people are going to be faced by these. Because coasts have always been popular areas for people to move to, and people continue to move into the coastal areas. They continue to grow. But again, these extreme weather events will cause redistribution of chemical pollutants that are in the ocean and coastlines, and you're going to see an expansion in chemical risk. And we're really further challenged by a lack of knowledge about several things. How does climate change directly or indirectly impact toxic algal bloom growth? That includes their initiation, development, and termination, and other characteristics that may influence the occurrence and severity of associated human disease. Can we evaluate health risks that are associated with climate change increases in the release and mobilization of these different chemical contaminants? And how will temperature changes impact the combination of these different types of toxins and chemicals and waterborne pathogens? These are likely to be changed, but we don't know how climate change is going to impact these relationships of these various different types of chemicals that people are going to be exposed to. So I want to focus a little bit on sea level rise, because this isn't something that my agency has really supported a lot of, but they're really an incredibly important aspect of climate change. Sea levels are rising because of thermal expansion. Warm water simply has a greater volume than cold water. Moreover, you have melting polar ice caps and glaciers that compound the problem of rising sea level, because they dump even greater volumes of fresh water into the ocean. These rising seas are threatening to inundate low-lying areas around the coast, as well as islands, and they threaten dense coastal populations. The rising sea levels also can erode shorelines, damage property, and destroy ecosystems property and ecosystems such as mangroves and wetlands that are protecting the coast against storms. And sea levels have risen between 10 and 20 centimeters in the past 100 years. Current projections suggest that sea levels could contribute to a rise between 10 and 90 centimeters over the next 100 years. And a 90 centimeter increase in sea levels would virtually swamp every city on the east coast of the United States, from Miami to Boston. Worldwide, you have approximately 100 million people that live within 90 centimeters of sea level. So a sea level rise associated with climate change could potentially displace tens of millions of people in low-lying areas, especially in developing countries. In fact, inhabitants of some small island nations that barely rest above the existing sea level are already abandoning their islands and have been designated as climate change refugees. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on, because there's an example actually that I want to point out to you. And it has to do with the place called the Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana. It's about 90 miles southwest of New Orleans. And in 2016, there was a $48 million grant that was given for the Isle de Jean Charles, which was the first U.S. federal allocation of tax dollars that was made to move the entire community that was struggling with the effects of climate change. You can see in this slide, this is a roadway that connects the island to the mainland. it gets flooded out regularly. It was being flooded out regularly. This is what it looks like in the larger picture. But it was flooded out regularly, really preventing access between the island and the mainland in Louisiana. And it prevented the community, which actually worked on the mainland, from getting back and forth. So actually having to relocate these folks has really proven to be, it really exposed a great division amongst the community members. People did not want to leave when people realized they had to leave, but it really kind of highlighted that kind of division amongst popular opinion or local opinion. And it also presented logistical and moral dilemmas in terms of moving people, moving an entire community. The sad thing about this, why I wanted to bring this to your attention, is it really represents a microcosm of the massive problems the entire world may face as a result of climate change and rising sea levels if we don't do anything to slow down what we're doing. Now, the women you see in this picture are sisters, and they're members of the Native American tribal population that was relocated from this island. What I want to point out to people is this is not some developing country somewhere located in the third world that doesn't have resources. This happened right outside of New Orleans. This is a problem that is without any type of slowdown in what we're doing to contribute to climate change. This is something that, roughly between 50 and 200 million people, based on projections, could end up being displaced by the year 2050 because of climate change and rising sea level. So I am going to get ready to stop here. I was going to go through a few more things. I want to point out, this is an article that was just published on September 7th. That actually is my oldest son's birthday. We not get to know, we won't spend any time on that. But this is from the New England Journal of Medicine. And it's generally, this was a large article that basically points out to folks that climate change is really, amongst these scientists and physicians' opinions, going to be the largest, greatest threat to public health globally. I'll leave you with that. I was going to tell you something about our relationship with the National Science Foundation, but I know that the time is getting short. So I want to, again, thank the organizers for this presentation, for the invitation, and also thank you for your attention and your interest in learning more about how the environment protects or impacts human health. And I will turn it back over to you all for questions, and I will stop sharing.
All right, well, great. Thank you, Fred, for that truly interesting talk that you have given us. And well, now as promised, we will continue on to a section of Q&A. And attendees can either raise their hands and say their questions out loud or send them through the chat. And I will gladly pass on the questions. So, all right, Fernando.
First of all, hi. Well, I was wondering, what about like rural areas that may not have access to filtered water? How could they minimize the impact that have on their health, like or their crops or their cattle, maybe?
Okay, well, even in rural areas, at least in the U.S., there are water monitoring stations. So one of the ways that again, we have water treatment plants that routinely do monitoring for HAB toxins. That is, we are also trying to increase through my agency does not do policy, but the scientists that we support do interact with agencies like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. They have standards that they use and are routinely monitoring water quality for HABs. But your point is actually very well taken. We were not able to support this grant, but a few years ago, I did have an application that came in because people were actually concerned about HAB toxins getting into their irrigation water that they use. And that ultimately, you can see some of these toxins, and their preliminary data showed that it can get into crops. So that's another route of exposure. So the ways that we can do this, again, is through increased monitoring. And trying to improve the water, the services that are available to folks in rural areas. folks that are not connected to any type of organization that can actually do this monitoring are at risk. But again, in the almost in the U.S., most folks have access to some type of municipal system that routinely monitors water quality. I can tell you, certainly in the more urban areas, back in 2014, we had to close down in Toledo, Ohio, which is an urban area. The entire water processing system had shut down, and folks had to drink bottled water for a few weeks until they were able to ascertain that the levels of toxin that were related to a severe cyanobacteria outbreak in Lake Erie at that particular region around Toledo had subsided, so they could do that. But it's basically got up against municipalities, even in rural areas, to routinely monitor water.
Okay, thank you so much.
And Josephine?
Hi. My question is, how does heat relate to cardiovascular failure? Could you tell us more about that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. How does heat relate to cardiovascular failure?
You say how does heat? Did you say how does heat?
I think I can repeat the question if you want. She's asking how heat, like
Okay.
extreme heat, relates to
Okay,
cardiovascular failure.
how does heat relate to that? What the rising temperatures do is the rising temperatures, they contribute to a decline in air quality by different things that happen to the gases and other types of particulate matter that are in the air. They also contribute to an increased respiration that we have, and it increases the gases in it. What they ultimately do is you have some people that have underlying cardiovascular issues. So people who have underlying cardiovascular issues, if you have a decrease in air quality, that then impacts their cardiovascular function. And folks who have underlying issues generally can, or not generally, they are at much higher risk. We can show data. There's something called the convection event that can happen around Denver, Colorado, where you have increased incidence of smog. That's something that shows that when you have a real major decrease in air quality, there is a corresponding increase in the frequency and number, or the number and perhaps also severity of myocardial infarctions or heart attacks that coincide with real acute changes in air quality. So I can't actually tell you physiologically what happens, but I tell you that there is a very clear linear relationship that exists with air quality indices being bad. I don't know if you all get these. We daily get air quality reports that tell us whether it's a yellow zone, green zone, orange zone, whatever. When the air quality is bad, people that have underlying or known cardiovascular issues have a much greater risk for having heart attacks. So how mechanistically that actually works, I'm actually, if you wanted to know what I am, I'm a genomics and genetics person, so I couldn't tell you physiologically what happens, but there is a very linear relationship between air quality and heart attack, incident heart attacks.
All right, well, thank you. We actually do have that in Mexico, and we use it a lot to see how the air quality is here, especially in the city, since it's usually like an orange or red. So that's really
that would be the reason why, because that helps people inform themselves. You need to stay indoors on days when you have particularly poor air quality. If you're a person that has respiratory or cardiovascular, it's already compromised.
All right, so we'll pass on to the next one. Isolda?
Yeah, taking more into account how the world works today, I want to ask, to what extent poverty and modernization of suburban areas affect pollution or air and oceans?
I don't know what effect poverty has on them, but I can tell you what effect the air pollution and other things have on people who, I can tell you what the associations are. Um, People who are at the lower end of the poverty spectrum, who are impoverished, generally have less access to healthcare. Okay, and they're going to be less inclined to visit a physician for a variety of reasons. Most of them have to do, again, with limited resources. But when you have these rises in things that impact folks, folks may actually not feel well, but they won't get treated because they don't have resources to being treated. In urban areas, this is particularly important. Well, it's also important in rural areas, but it's important where you have a large population density. So you have lots of vehicular traffic. You have air quality incidents that are really bad, or air quality indices that are really bad. I can tell you about, say, for instance, in New York City, you have areas of Manhattan that are at the lower end of the economic scale. So they're, you'd say poverty or low SES, low socioeconomic status. These are the places where people have the fewest amount of resources to battle. You have they'll put bus depots, which are major contributors to bad air quality in terms of diesel exhaust fumes. They'll put these in areas where people don't have the resources to say, no, you're not going to put this health hazard in my neighborhood. They do that deliberately because people can't, they put them in where it's cheapest for them to put it. And when you have a population that doesn't have the resource to fight it, that population automatically is now facing higher risk. That comes under the umbrella of something we call environmental justice, which I would actually like to call environmental injustice. The bottom line is poorer people are facing greater risk, primarily because they don't have the economic resources to stop people from locating things that impact air quality near where they live or where they go to school or where they work. The same thing actually happens in rural areas too, with what we call concentrated farming or agricultural operations, or concentrated agricultural or farming operations, or CAFOs. These are where you have things like hog farms or poultry farms, where you'd have to actually see how concentrated these operations are. And the waste from the livestock gets deposited in something that people like to prettily call lagoons. Lagoons is actually the formal term, but what the real term should be is cesspools. You have all this animal waste. This animal waste goes into these lagoons. It can impact the air quality because the fumes, the methane gas, this stuff gets in the air. Again, they don't situate these around people that have economic resources. They get put around people that are poor, that are poorer. So these are the people that face the greater burdens of the exposure, and then subsequently, because they have greater exposures, they have greater health risk, and then because they have less resources, they get less health care. So the relationship to poverty and pollution and health is from what I said, a very sad one, because again, people who have less resources are less able to protect themselves, and they catch the brunt of the exposures. And again, that's really the relationship. The relationship has to do, but you are recording it, so I'll be careful what I say, but it's basically about it's an economic thing.
All right, well, thank you. And now, Elisa.
Yeah, sorry. Well, my question is, how does you believe this threat to the ocean has changed during the pandemic? Has something changed, or
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
how do you believe that this ocean threat has changed during the pandemic?
How have the oceans changed during the pandemic?
The threat to the ocean?
I'm sorry, I'm still having difficulty understanding the question.
If you want, I can try to repeat the question. How do you believe that the threat to the ocean has changed during the pandemic?
What to the ocean has changed during the pandemic?
The threat, because of like
What to the
increasing
ocean has changed during the pandemic?
Yes.
Um, you know, I don't know that it's changed much during the pandemic. Um, it may actually have lessened a little bit during the pandemic because a lot of the contributors to pollution, okay, one of the things I talked about was atmospheric deposition. That's air quality. During the pandemic, at least during the earlier parts, I don't know about right now, but during the earlier stages of the pandemic, people stayed in. There was a huge reduction in vehicular traffic. Okay, so with this huge reduction in vehicular traffic, you had a reduction in emissions of gases that get into the air that ultimately can be deposited in the ocean. You have a reduction in the amount of oil. You know, I talked about engine oil. Because you had this reduction in vehicular transport, you have a reduction in the amount of pollutants that are associated with vehicles that are getting onto the roadways and then being washed in. You actually are seeing in different areas where just kind of anecdotally watching some National Geographic channels on TV, seeing that animals are actually starting to move around more in areas where we weren't seeing them, you know, wildlife, because the human contact isn't there. And it's safer for them to come out. So we actually have had a reduction, I think, in some of our pollution as a result of the pandemic. So if we talk about any benefit of the pandemic, which is hard to find any, it may be that during the course of people not going out as much, not traveling as much, that we reduced our human imprint on the environment. And that would have been something that didn't make the ocean that well. It did by in terms of we just reduced the rate that we were polluting it. Now that people have started moving around again, we probably will see that diminish, the positive impact diminish. But just the fact that people were really, not in a small way, but significantly traveling around a lot less, that reduced our human impact, our human imprint, our human contribution to pollution that's going into the oceans.
Last question that I just got sent from the chat. They were wondering if you happen to know the effect that face masks in the ocean have. Are they degradable, or do animals mistake them for food? What has happened to like this new type of pollution?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I actually have no idea. I mean, if these things are showing up, as debris in the ocean, I don't know. I would imagine that they could, I don't know if people are developing masks that are biodegradable or not. I seriously doubt that they are. And I would imagine that, again, these are things that that fish and marine mammals are probably coming in contact with. And as you say, are they eating them? Yeah, they probably are ingesting them, but do they come out? Don't know. I have no idea. That's a great question. I'm not seeing anything, any kind of data addressing that. What I see right now in terms of the big groundswell of things, in terms of what is impacting wildlife, if you would, in the ocean, is the contribution of plastics. Okay. That is, I don't know if masks are an issue, and I can appreciate what you're saying, because I probably have 30 masks sitting in my drawers at my desk right now. I don't think I've thrown any away. In fact, I said 30 is probably an underestimate. I probably have about 50. I haven't thrown anything away yet, but I don't know what's happening with people when they discard it. I don't know what happens to them when people discard them. I don't know if they're going in landfill or they're ultimately making their way out to the ocean. I would suspect if they're making their way out to the ocean, then they're going to be similar to what we're seeing with plastic. And if they get out there in the same kind of volume that plastic is getting out there, then we have a whole new problem that we've not considered yet.
All right. Well, I think now that would be the end of the Q&A section. Thank you so much, Fred, for your time and for your wonderful presentation. And so as a way of thank you to you and on behalf of the Tecnológico de Monterrey, we have prepared a certificate for you. Right now, I think Kato will be sharing his screen, and we will also send it to you by email later today. And well, on behalf of all the faculty and the student body that accompanied us today, we just would like to thank you once again for your presence in this event. And We reiterate our invitation to continue participating in future events. So thank you to you and everyone who attended today, and we sincerely hope that everyone has a great day today.
Thank you all so much again for the invitation, the opportunity to speak with you. I only wish I'd had the opportunity to visit.
Maybe in the future, we'll see if we can
Maybe.
make that happen.